Welcome back to Game Nights at ARY'S. Today we are going to be taking a look at Root, a game of Woodland might and right. You can see from the box art there, very obviously inspired by Mouse Guard, Redwall, various other children's books. So Root is, at its core, a strategy game, a war game. It is different than most others in the genre, being that it is an asymmetrical game. For those of you that have never played an asymmetrical game, what that entails is that every player has a different mechanic they are working with. Sometimes they can be very similar, like with Root. Other times they can be drastically different. There are games where one person is using cards to try and score their points and win the game. Another person would be doing worker placement, and a third player would be rolling dice. So even though they have the same goals, they would use different methods to achieve them. So let's cut over to the box here. We'll open it up and take a look at a few of the components. We'll start with a closer look at that box art. You can see the four main factions in their adorable glory. We have the Raccoon Vagabond, the EYRIE Dynasties, the Woodland Alliance, and the Marquise de Cat. So let's open this up and take a closer look at everything that comes inside. So at the top here, we have the first of three rule books. This one is the smallest and goes through 2 turns of every single faction, just so when you first start the game, you can walk through and see exactly what a sample game would be like. This rule book here is the one you're really going to want to start with. It's going to show the base rules for the game in an easy to understand way. And then the last rule book, the big one here, is going to break everything down point by point, section by section. When you're actually playing the game and you're confused about how things work, this is the one you're going to break out to get into the nitty-gritty details. Next up, we are going to have 4 faction boards here, one for each faction. And as I flip through them, you'll see each of them is fairly different. That is part of the asymmetrical nature of the game. Here we have the EYRIE Dynasties, the Marquise de Cat, the Vagabond, and the Woodland Alliance. Next in the box is this 6-part map. I'm not going to unfold it because it's pretty big. It is double-sided. One is the standard summer side that has all the clearings clearly labeled by animal type. The other is the winter side, which allows you to randomize what's what for a more advanced game. We have a set of 12-sided dice. Each die is labeled 0, 1, 2, and 3. During the game, you only use the dice for combat. The attacker rolls both dice, and the higher number is the attacker, the lower number is the defender. Interesting mechanic, just so the attacker doesn't hesitate to enter combat. It doesn't punish you as much, so it makes the games go a little quicker than other war games. Here we have the winter markers that allow you to randomize the map. These are the different cards. They do different effects for different factions. They are labeled in 4 suits. We have foxes, we have mice, we have rabbits, and then we have the birds, which act as wild cards. And here we have the pieces for each faction. The cats, the birds, the rabbits, or bunnies, and then the vagabonds. Most of them have quite a few meeples. The Vagabond plays a little different, almost like a little adventure game. So he only gets 1. Let's take a closer look at each of the factions now, and we can get a little more in-depth with them. The first faction we will be taking a look at today is the Marquise de Cat. I believe that this is the easiest faction to learn. It is lowest in complexity, and it is most similar to the style that other war games operate in. They have 3 separate buildings that they can produce: sawmills, workshops, and recruiters. Each one they build grants them additional victory points, getting them up to that 30 points that wins the game. Sawmills will produce wood, which they use to produce buildings. Workshops allow them to use the cards that they have in their hand for various effects. And then recruiters will allow them to recruit a whole bunch of angry cat minions. The cats also have 2 abilities built in. The first one is the Keep, which is a home base that stops the other factions from using any kind of special abilities to just drop a bunch of warriors right in their lap. And the second is the Field Hospitals, which allow the cats to discard a card from their hand that matches the area they are in and save a bunch of warriors that would be dying rather than lose them. Interesting things of note with the cat as well is their move orders are different than the other factions. Most other factions, when they take a move, they take any number of units from a pasture and move them to the next pasture. The cat's move orders allow them to march or do 2 separate moves. Gets them a little more bang for their buck. And then the second one that's interesting is the recruitment. When they recruit, they place a warrior at every single recruiter space they have on the board. The other factions, when they recruit, they place 1, so that allows the cats to rebuild and spread out fairly quickly. Let's take a look at the next faction here. The second faction that we are going to take a look at is the EYRIE Dynasties. They are slightly more complicated than the cats, but still fairly easy to learn. It's obvious the cats and birds are the ones they want you to learn the game with if you're only doing 2 players. So they are different than the cats in a few ways. They still have buildings they build, roosts, but rather than earning points for each one they build, at the end of their turn, they get points for each one they still have around. They do have 2 special abilities. They are Lords of the Forest, so rather than having to have the most number of units in an area, they own it simply by tying. And they have a disdain for trade, so the victory points they earn from the cards that you can craft is limited to 1, so it kind of pushes them away from that. The mechanics for the birds do switch up quite a bit differently than the rest of the factions. At the beginning of the game, they're going to pick a leader, and each one has a different category of actions they take. We'll pick the Vulture. It wants you to put your Viziers on Move and Build. So each turn, the EYRIE Dynasties have to take at least 1 card from their hand and put them in the different spots on the board. This is the decree. It is what you are telling your people that you are going to do that turn, what you are going to accomplish. If for whatever reason you can't accomplish it, you go into turmoil, you're going to lose some points, you're going to get rid of your leader and pick a new one and end your turn. So the way the decree works is you're going to go from recruit and work your way to build, doing the actions based on the suit of the card that's there. So right now we have it set up that it says we are going to move a unit from a wild card, so you could choose any location and just move some units. And we're also going to build in any location. Pretty easy to do. As you add cards, you're eventually going to get to the point where you cannot possibly accomplish everything you said to, and you'll end up in turmoil. So the EYRIE Dynasties work on a very much boom-bust mechanic where they start out slow and then they start performing many actions a turn until they can't keep up, and then they drop back down and start fresh again. The third faction that we are going to be looking at is the Vagabond. It is slightly more complex than the first two we looked at, and mechanically it is the most distinct. Rather than playing out like a war game, like most of the factions do in Root, the Vagabond plays out more like an adventure game. Rather than having a whole army, you just get a single little raccoon goon. At the beginning of the game, you're going to pick a character card, which determines which starting equipment you get and a special ability. They all kind of operate slightly different, giving you a different play style. You get these items with an S, depending on what you pick, that allow you to do different actions. The raccoon is unique in that there are places on the board that are covered with runes. And in a game without the Vagabond, they are permanently covered and you can never use them. With the Vagabond, he can clear them for items and open up more real estate for the rest of the people to fight over. As far as the factions go, the Vagabond is the most political. They do rely on other factions crafting items for them. That would be these here, which allow them to take different actions. In order to get those items, once the other factions craft cards to make them, they have to give those factions a card to purchase them. This affects the relationship track, which scores victory points and eventually makes the Vagabond allied with them. There are also quest markers here. Those are just an example. There are quite a few more that you have to use different items to complete, which either gets you more cards or more victory points to get you closer to that 30-point goal. The Vagabond does have different movement rules than everyone else. They can expend a boot to move, or they can, at the beginning of their turn, go into the forest and then jump out anywhere on the next turn. As far as combat goes, they cannot have their meeple destroyed, but for every damage they take, they have to damage an item, which in order to repair, they have to go into the woods and spend a turn repairing. You can see they have a different little icon for each of their actions. Definitely, I think, the most unique of the four factions. Let's take a look at that last one now. The last of the four factions of Root is the Woodland Alliance. They are, in my opinion, the most complicated and the easiest to build yourself into a position where it's nearly impossible to win. They are a guerrilla force that rely on other factions making mistakes to propel them to victory. They have these sympathy tokens. This whole track starts filled up. They put those on clearings, which represent animals that live in those clearings that support their cause. Once per turn, they may put a card from their hand into the supporter track here, which would each one would match a different clearing type, the rabbits, the mice, or the fox, or if you're lucky, a wild card bird. They can spend 1, 2, or 3, depending on how many tokens they have out, to put a sympathy marker in one of the adjacent clearings. And then at the beginning of their turn, they may revolt. If they have 2 supporter cards that match a clearing with a sympathy token in, they can remove all the enemy pieces there and place a matching base and warriors there equal to the total amount of sympathetic clearings. Then you place a warrior in the officer box. There are more tokens in this. I just brought out a couple. What the officer box represents is the amount of actions you get a turn. So when you first revolt, you're only going to get 1 action a turn. Now, only putting 1 supporter on the track here would make for a very slow game for the Woodland Alliance. So the ability they have is Outrage. So whenever another player attacks those sympathetic villagers, or even just moves warriors into the clearing, that player has to take a card from their hand that matches the clearing and give it to the Woodland Alliance. And if they can't,
the Woodland Alliance just gets to draw a card and add it straight to the supporter pile. The second ability that the Woodland Alliance has, which is kind of unique compared to the rest, is that they are masters of guerrilla war. When the attacker rolls dice against them, they get to use the higher one as the defender. So it does actually make the other people hesitant to attack them. They may come out completely behind in combat. The Woodland Alliance is unique compared to the rest in that they have high crafting power. They're most likely going to be the ones making items for the raccoons. For each sympathy marker in a clearing, that allows them to craft items. So rather than having to build the workshops like the cats or have a roost in an area like the birds, early on in the game, they can begin crafting and have quite a few different cards that power them up. So the Woodland Alliance does have the biggest moving parts, and depending on how you place officers in your officer track, you can get to the point where you have 5 or 6 actions and only a couple of warriors on the board, which makes it really hard to accomplish anything. So I would say the Woodland Alliance is most suited for an advanced player who's used to a lot of nitty-gritty strategy. With that being said, just a quick overview of each of the factions. Let's take a look and do a review here.
So how does Root measure up? Let's run it through my board game grading criteria and see. So as always, the first thing I ask is rulebook clarity. Is it easy to understand? As I mentioned before, Root comes with 3 separate rulebooks that start you out simple and then work into the minutia. So I will say it absolutely nails rulebook clarity and gets you going right away, then works out any questions you may have later. Is it mechanically sound and intuitive? Granted, your mileage may vary. This is an asymmetrical game with 4 separate rule sets for 4 separate factions. But yes, each of them are fairly easy to understand and fairly easy to get going and learning. How about monetary value? I bought my copy for $50 at a convention. Kind of a running theme here. So I got it on sale. I was happy. Looks like on average it is $60 to $70 online now. So that is a high barrier to entry for some people for a game like this. I would still say it's worth it, but I would say honestly it's kind of middle of the road compared to most games at this point. So the next question is it immersive? Each faction has its own theme. We went over them. You saw they each do their own thing. And I would say that, yes, each one very much so is loyal to its theme and very immersive in that effect. Is Root replayable? So the base game comes with the standard map and then the randomized winner map and 4 factions. The game right now has 3 expansions out, and a 4th one I believe is on Kickstarter right now that adds something like I believe 5 new factions to the game, which shakes it up quite a bit. Definitely a lot of replayability there. So how does Root compare to other games in its genre? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say middle of the road on this one. It carves out its own niche, but there's just so many different things on the market, from simple war games like Go to more complex tabletop miniature games like Warhammer. But Root does carve out its own little niche and does its own thing well. So I will say it's not a poor grade, just an average one. How is the time investment factor? With 3 players, which is what most of our games ended up being, it took roughly an hour to play each game. With that being said, a solid 20 minutes of each game was each player trying to figure out the mechanics of their faction and, more importantly, how they interact with the other factions, or the best way to interact with the other factions. So fairly quick game to get going. Honestly, probably quicker once you know the rules for all the factions. So the most important question, is Root fun? Yes. absolutely, I believe Root is fun. As I said, I bought the other expansions as soon as I finished playing the base game. So I'm sold on it. I've only had one real complaint, and I can agree with this, that if everyone else on the table has played the game and they understand the mechanics for each of the factions, it's going to be considerably harder for a new player. But that is most board games. No one's going to jump in and be as good as a veteran player on their first time around. So let's bring up my grading sheet here and let you see a visual representation of this. I hope everyone found the video informative. If you were considering Root, hopefully it led you in the right direction. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't, and we will see you next time.